1989 was a year in which the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Forces continued to face the ever-increasing challenges of meeting Canada's defence commitments and assisting the international community. At the same time, the Canadian Forces continued to replace equipment and prepare for the future. The Canadian Forces are Canada's largest peace movement. Canada has participated in almost every United Nations peacekeeping operation since 1948. They've also been members of some that were not sponsored by the UN. Over 80,000 Canadian men and women have worn the blue beret or other identification as peacekeepers. Canada's single largest peacekeeping task continues to be in Cyprus. Canadian soldiers have served there since 1964. In March of 1989, the Royal Canadian Dragoons from Petawawa, Ontario, took over the Canadian sector. In the fall, they were replaced by the Winnipeg-based 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Earlier in the year, the Canadian government accepted a request from the United Nations to appoint a Canadian as commander of the UN forces in Cyprus. And in April, Major General Clive Milner took command of the 2,300 British, Canadian, Austrian, and Danish troops on the island. It's the first time in 30 years that a Canadian has commanded a UN force. The appointment indicates the high esteem in which Canada is held in the international peacekeeping community. With the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan, refugees returning to their homes in the Afghan countryside face countless landmines and booby traps, a legacy of their country's struggle. In an effort to help those refugees prepare for the future, the first 12-member team of Canadian Forces explosive experts was sent to Peshawar, Pakistan in late March. The team instructed Afghan refugees on mine awareness, safety measures, and simple methods of clearing mines. 3 women were included amongst the officers in the first Canadian team. They trained Afghan women who in turn taught the skills they had learned to other Afghan women and their children. It is they who are most at risk from the presence of mines. By the end of 1989, 3 teams of Canadians had helped teach the Afghans this vital knowledge. In April, 250 Canadians arrived in Namibia as part of the newly created United Nations Transition Assistance Group, or UNTAG. UNTAG's role is to assist Namibia's transition to independent nationhood. The Canadian contingent's largest element is 89 Canadian Logistics Unit. It provides transportation, maintenance, and supply platoons to the United Nations Logistics Support Group, which in turn supports the 4,700-member UNTAG force. And in 1989, Canadian Forces personnel found themselves involved in another new and challenging peacekeeping situation. With the deployment of Canadian Forces members to Central America, Canada's contribution to world peacekeeping duties increased to 9 missions involving 1,300 servicemen and women. About 160 reservists were among those who served with peacekeeping missions outside Canada in 1989. This further demonstrates that the total force concept can work, since they stand alongside their regular force partners not only in training, but also on operational duty. Canadian peacekeepers span the globe, wearing their blue berets on the Golan Heights, in Iran and Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Korea, in Israel, Syria and Lebanon, in India or Pakistan, on Cyprus, in Namibia, and in Central America. Others wear the orange beret of the multinational force and observers in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. No matter where you find them, Canada's armed forces continue their proud tradition of contributing to the international efforts of conflict resolution and peace. When it comes to reducing tension among the world's nations, peacekeeping operations are the department's most visible actions. But there are many other less visible efforts that are as important. For example, experts on arms control from the Department of National Defense and the Armed Forces participate in international forums and conferences. In January, the Defense Department announced that Canada would undertake a series of measures aimed at improving military relations with the Soviet Union. These included reciprocal ships visits to Soviet ports, talks at a senior level between Soviet and Canadian military staffs, and an invitation for Soviet officials to visit the Defense Research Establishment at Suffield, Alberta. In July, a Soviet delegation observed the chemical agent destruction process being used in Canada. And later in the year, a delegation of senior Canadian military officers visited the Soviet Union. Exchanges such as these include familiarization visits to defense bases, discussions, and sharing of information on arms control measures. Canada remains committed to peace, security, and sovereignty through collective defense. Canada's security is ensured through membership in NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. April 4th marked the 40th anniversary of NATO. The alliance is now made up of 16 nations, 600 million people united in their quest of maintaining peace by means of a common defense. Our enduring peace exists thanks to the alliance's two goals: maintaining a deterrent against hostilities through a strong defense and promoting arms control. Being a member of NATO is of great benefit to Canada. It provides national security at far less cost than an independent or neutral policy. It also gives Canada an equal voice in collective decisions taken by the alliance, while allowing the pursuit of an independent foreign policy. And NATO is not only a military alliance, it's also a forum for the exchange of ideas on political, economic, scientific, and social issues. The bulk of our military contribution in Europe to the alliance consists of a land division and an air division. That land division was officially dedicated to a Central European role on November 30th during a ceremony held at Lahr, West Germany. Canada's 4th Mechanized Brigade is located in Germany and makes up one half of the land division. The other half is the 5e Groupe Brigade du Canada. It would be sent overseas from its base in Valcartier, Quebec, in time of increased tension. Some 8,000 Canadian Forces troops plus their families live in Europe. Most of them reside and work at our two main bases, located at Lahr and Baden-Solingen, West Germany. Baden-Solingen is home to 3 CF-18 squadrons of 1 Canadian Air Division. Like the land division, only half of the air division's strength is in Europe. The rest would fly over from their bases in Canada when they were needed. Canada also contributes a destroyer on a rotational basis to the Standing Naval Force Atlantic, which is a fleet of warships from various NATO members. The sailors of Her Majesty's Canadian ships Marguerite, Saguenay, and Ottawa spent lengthy periods away from their families during 1989 while their ships sailed with the force. Canada's traditional ties to Europe continue as a cornerstone of Canada's defense commitments. But our country continues to increase its social and economic ties with the Pacific Rim nations. Changes to the Canadian Navy reflect this fact. In 1989, 443 Helicopter Squadron was moved to the West Coast, along with the helicopter-carrying destroyer Annapolis. HMCS Huron, a destroyer also capable of carrying Sea King helicopters, had been transferred from Halifax to Esquimalt, British Columbia, along with 2 helicopters in 1987. Before these moves, Canada had no anti-submarine helicopters on the West Coast. These transfers help balance our anti-submarine capability on both coasts. They also enhance the Canadian Forces' ability to respond to search and rescue needs on the Pacific coast. In June, the government purchased 3 Arctic and maritime surveillance aircraft. The planes are called Arcturus and are similar to the CP-140 Auroras that the Canadian Forces operate, except that they do not have anti-submarine capability. The Arcturus will be used for military, environmental, maritime, and Arctic surveillance. They will also increase Canada's ability to effectively patrol its coastline and enforce our sovereignty. In 1989, the Navy continued to move forward with the replacement of some of its older destroyers. At year's end, 7 new frigates were at various stages of construction. These ships are part of a program that will add 12 new frigates to the Navy's inventory. At the same time, other Navy ships are undergoing major modifications. Built in the early 70s, the 4 Tribal-class destroyers are being updated and modernized. Their capabilities will be greatly enhanced. New air defense weapons, improved engines, and more effective command and control facilities will ensure the destroyers remain operationally fit for the future. In September, Canada's Naval Reserves commissioned 2 mine countermeasures vessels at a ceremony held in Halifax. The Moresby and the Anticosti will provide the reserves with valuable mine warfare training experience. The expansion of the Naval Reserve as part of the Total Force concept continued in October when a new unit was commissioned in Sept-Îles, Quebec. HMCS Joliette is the 4th such unit established in Quebec in the last 3 years in an attempt to increase the presence of the Navy in that province. Meanwhile, the government announced plans for the purchase of 221 light armored vehicles for Canada's militia regiments. The purchase of these vehicles will continue the modernization and re-equipping of the militia. Delivery will begin in the summer of 1990. The modernization of the Land Forces military pattern truck fleet continued in 1989. In June, defense officials attended the rollout ceremony of the first of the Army's new 10-ton trucks. By the time deliveries completed in 1991, Canada's land forces will have received 1,200 of the heavy trucks. Canada and the United States share the world's longest undefended border. But under the North American Aerospace Defense Agreement, Canadian and U.S. forces operate a system of long and short-range radars, airborne radars, and deployment airfields. This network is capable of detecting air or spaceborne threats, such as bombers or missiles. It is backed up by fighter interceptor aircraft located strategically about the continent. Canada's NORAD fighters are CF-18s. A number of them are kept on constant state of alert at our 2 main fighter bases located at Cold Lake, Alberta, and Bagotville, Quebec. At the same time, detachments from those bases occupy forward operating locations closer to the country's coasts. These planes are ready to fly out, intercept, and identify any airborne threat approaching the continent. While it has now taken delivery of all its new CF-18s, the Air Force said goodbye to an old friend in 1989. After nearly 50 years of exceptional service, the C-47 Dakota, affectionately known as the Goonie Bird, made its final flights and retired from military service in Canada. 2 of the last Dakotas were painted up in World War II colors. In March, one flew west wearing the markings of D-Day when the Allies invaded Europe in June of 1944. The other flew east, carrying the Canucks Unlimited logo, recognized by all those in the Asian theater who relied on the Canadian flyers to deliver supplies in the mountains and jungles of Burma and India. They visited bases and cities across Canada and allowed enthusiasts, and many who flew in them, one last chance to see a serving Canadian Forces Goonie Bird fly. 2 of Canada's infantry regiments celebrated history of their own in 1989. The Royal 22e Regiment and the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry were formed at the outbreak of the Great War. In the past 75 years, Vandus and Patricias have served in both world wars, Korea, with NATO, and in many peacekeeping operations. The regiments marked their years of proud service to Canada with a series of celebrations across the country and by a ceremonial parade on Parliament Hill. 200 Patricias also reenacted their World War I homecoming parade in Ottawa and marched past the National War Memorial. Canada's military have often been called upon to come to the aid of people caught in the path of nature's fury, and in 1989 that tradition continued. Hit by some of the worst forest fires on record, Manitobans fought a fierce and sometimes desperate battle to save several towns and villages. The Canadian Forces helped fly residents of 22 northern communities to safer places. 8 fixed-winged aircraft and 4 helicopters flew 125 missions and moved supplies and nearly 6,000 people. And in late September, Hurricane Hugo swept through the Caribbean and on some islands left near total devastation in its wake. The next day, a Canadian Forces Hercules delivered civil authorities, food and relief supplies from Barbados to Montserrat, St. Kitts and Antigua. But there was more to be done. After consultation with international relief agencies, it was decided that Canadian Forces aid could be best used to relieve the disaster situation on Montserrat. That tiny island was without doubt the worst hit by Hugo. Critical to this relief effort was the immediate restoration of an effective air traffic control capability. On September 27th, a portable control tower was flown in from Trenton, Ontario, and put into operation. The airlift and relief effort could now go on. The 4 members of a communications line crew were tasked to lay phone lines between government agencies to establish basic telephone communications. 25 field engineers from Petawawa set about assisting the local authorities in restoring power and water facilities. They also began repairing Montserrat's control tower and airport facilities. The Canadian International Development Agency purchased 6 large generators. Canadian Forces engineers assisted in the startup and maintenance of the generators, which provided the power to get drinking water flowing again. In January, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney selected a new federal cabinet and named 2 new ministers to the defense portfolio. Bill McKnight of wartime Saskatchewan was appointed minister, and Mary Collins of Vancouver took over as associate minister. The role of women in Canadian society and in the military continues to expand. Associate Defense Minister Mary Collins announced in March that the department would begin implementing the decision of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal concerning the role of women in the armed forces. Nearly all occupations, units, and positions are now accessible to women. This also means that women are no longer excluded from the most senior appointments in the forces. General Paul Manson, Chief of Defense Staff for the previous 3 years, took to the air one last time in 1989 before retiring as Canada's top military man. A few days later, he said his farewell to the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who served him, and handed over command of the Canadian Forces to General John de Chastelain during a parade held in Ottawa. General de Chastelain takes command of Canada's military in challenging times. In 1989, the world continued to evolve in ways impossible to imagine just a few short years ago. New roles and priorities are being determined in order to maintain a credible level of defense, especially in light of new budgetary realities. Peacekeeping missions increase yearly, and Canada's professionalism and expertise in that field continue to be drawn upon by a world struggling to reduce international conflict. Through it all, the men and women of Canada's armed forces and the 35,000 civilian members of the Department of National Defence continue to meet the challenges head-on. They take pride in the job they do for their country and in the help they bring to their fellow Canadians and the people of other nations.